a lot of people ask me, you know, how do I explain to someone who isn't au fait with trans issues, what, kind of the ins and outs of, what trans issues are? Do you have any specific videos that you can you can give me to show my friend, my coworker, my family member, that shows them what the trans existence is about, because these people are uneducated, and if they don't get educated by someone who knows what they're talking about, they're just going to find out from J.K. Rowling or Jacqueline Wilson or someone else like that, right? So they need to have, at least a learned individual, which I like to think that I am. I am clearly a very, very learned individual. At least on trans issues, I think I'd probably be a reasonable author about that. So I thought I would put together a segment where I talk about the kind of the main thing issues surrounding transness and what it even is, and like how we talk about it and the way that it gets framed in society. Now, the first thing I want to talk about when we talk about gender is we want to talk about sex, biological sex first of all, and what this is as a concept, both scientifically, but in in a utilitarian sense as well. Now, what most people have in their idea of sex is male and female. Now, from a scientific sense, that's not true. There's intersex people are a thing as well. Now, how has this divergence of thought from reality happened? And that is because of the social utility regarding the aspects of sex. In that the vast majority of the entirety of human history, we've not been able to genotype people or anything like that. When you were born, they looked at your genitalia and they said, penis is a boy, vulva is a girl. There you go. There was that singular thing that happened, and that was how we delineated between the sexes, right? Nice and simple at this point. But you can see there are people who have, genitalia at this point that are not easily identifiable as one or the other. So that makes this particular method of sexing kids being sexing babies rather. Sexing kids sounds like a really bad phrase, so of sexing babies to not be particularly useful from a social sense, because there's a clearly kind of murky ground. So then we have to move on from our scientific issues. So there's things like chromosomes, but even these aren't binary either. There are chromatids that you can have that are a mixture of XXYY, XXY, YYX, all that kind of malarkey. And so it's clearly a lot more murky than what the idea that we have of just XX and XY. This is where intersexuality comes in, because a lot of these people have abnormal chromosome pairs that are outside of the binary of XX and XY, which is why we would refer to sex as bimodal, not binary. There are two very high peaks, but there's some deviations from these peaks as well, rather than being two specific discrete categories. Where most people fall into them, there are still some outliers, right? But then you also, as well as the secondary sex characteristics or primary sex characteristics that people can visually see, and then there are the scientific ideas such as your chromosomes and your hormonal makeup as well, which are more biological in nature. All of these different things as kind of all come together to give us our relative understanding of what biological sex is. And from a utilitarian perspective, what does sex even matter? I mean, doctors need to know your biology to offer you effective treatments, right? Because that's going to be really important for you. For example, one of the anti-androgens I take is called finasteride. Now, if you give that to a cis woman, it would make her infertile, right? So you need to understand that only certain things that happen to people with certain bodies, right? So you need that your doctor needs to know the internal workings of how your body works. Now, obviously, that's slightly more complex than just, are you assigned female at birth, are you assigned male at birth, because not only can people who are assigned a certain gender at birth, because as we've already discussed, that happens just by looking at genitalia, the configuration of your genitalia, and then just slapping an M or an F on it, right? It can be more complicated than that. So people with different chromosomal makeups can have different outer external genitalia to internal reproductive organs. They can have undescended penises and testes. All that kind of stuff falls under the intersex umbrella. Means that you have to know more than just your birth designation sex to understand these issues. So what I'm trying to have the conclusion here is that what we think of as biological sex is way more murky than we think it is. Now, when you speak to TERFs, they've done this goalpost shifting thing over time, where they've just decided, right, okay, vagina means woman, right? That's how we're going to define womanhood as part of society, right? Because that's what the female sex is defined. And then as chromosomes came along, as part of this argument, especially since in the biggest way in which you can define intersexuality is through the physical features that make people slightly different than the binary system, right? So the easy way of seeing someone who has atypical genital configurations, part of the intersex category in this instance, that's very easy. That's very easy to be able to make different. So when they move on to TERFs, will move on from there and then go towards a chromosomal argument and say, well, XX and XY, these clearly define what sex is, right? But then again, as we've discussed, with these different chromosomal pairs existing, it's even more murky than that. So then they move the goalposts even further, and then they'll say, oh, it's actually gametes. That's what defines sex. So whether you make an egg or whether you make sperm, right? Although plenty of insects, people don't make either because a lot of the time they're infertile. But then also they have reproductive configurations that are even different from that. So it's still a pretty murky concept. But you can see how people's idea of what constitutes sex or biological sex, it's not constant, and it's not through any kind of amount of empiricism or anything like that. It all stems from the social utility that we ascribe to sex as a concept. And that's why the goalposts keep shifting, because as science becomes on further, these original arguments about the TERFs give about biological sex, they all break down, right? So that's a general idea of the contentious issue around sex. And because we understand that it's not really a kind of concrete concept that we can just ascribe to people on a whim, we have to think about how gender works. Now, what gender is, it is a social role or designation that we ascribe to people and people ascribe to themselves, okay? So we've got to kind of separate this into two kind of distinct categories, in that there is gender identity in terms of social role, and there are also, or gender is like the way in which we ascribe gender roles to people, and the way people internalize their own gender. Now, this happens in a multitude of different ways. So to start off with, like, an internal sense of gender. Now, it's my belief, I think that these all stem from the kind of social prescriptions that we give to gender. So, for example, there's a very famous argument between Ben Shapiro and Blair White, between these two figures, where Ben Shapiro was of the opinion that the pronouns that we assign to men and women, so he and she, are rooted in biology. But Blair White posits that that's not how this works. If you saw a trans woman from the back in a crowded bar, not knowing that she's trans, and you look at the way in which she presents herself as a woman, you would instinctively use she. And that is the prescription that we have as a society on the specific role of womanhood, because this is how we perceive it. But that isn't exactly how it maps onto gender identity, because these prescriptions that we have throughout society map onto people's internal sense of their own gender, right? And then, because what people can or may or may not have, trans people, they may or may not have gender dysphoria, which is, to put it in more kind of technical terms, it is an intense discomfort that you feel with either your birth assignation, your sexual birth assignation, or the gender role that you've been prescribed by society. If there's that incongruence with your internal sense of your own gender and the way people perceive your own gender, that can be very distressing, or the physical features that you have don't map onto how you feel. And as studies will show, this gets engendered into people from a very, very early age. They develop their own sense of internal gender at the age of 2 or 3, I think, was the study that I saw about this particular issue, right? So people understand where they fit in this kind of social paradigm, and you see how this has changed throughout history about the way in which people would engage with these social paradigms, right? So when you look at the social roles that describes people, like, for example, I internally feel like a woman, right? I have very distinct what I would call physical dysphoria, in that I see the way that my body looks and it doesn't match how I feel inside, right? I look at it and I feel like it should be different. Whereas someone who has a more kind of social dysphoria, where the way they are treated by other people doesn't match the way they internally feel like they should be treated, right? If that's an oversimplification, it's definitely an oversimplification, but it gets across the idea of the difference between a physical dysphoria and a social dysphoria. Now, I have long hair, I wear makeup, and I wear these particular clothes, not because I feel like it should change the way people treat me, even though it does, but it also it conforms to a certain amount of things that would make it so that people would instinctively perceive me as a woman, which makes life easier, right? I don't feel invalidated by being misgendered in the way that some other people who have various acute kind of social dysphoria would do, for example. So these are kind of difficult concepts to get your head around. I understand that, but that's where a lot of trans existence comes from. It comes from people who have these particular dysphorias about the way that they exist within a gendered society, right? So that kind of explains, in a roundabout way, how trans people fit into these kind of social prescriptions that we have about what gender is as a concept, and the kind of social utility that gender plays in ascribing things to people, and the way that trans people pervade throughout society is different from the way they feel internally, because a lot of social pressures come from the social roles that people are expected to perform. Like gender being a performance is it's a Judith Butler theory about how people experience gender, and that essentially gender is ascribed to you by society in this particular theoretical framework. So if you look like what people would expect a woman to look like, and you act like how people expect a woman to act, then by all intents and purposes you are a woman as far as these people are concerned, which I don't necessarily agree with, or I do agree with partly. It definitely makes a case for the idea that gender is a pretty murky concept in the same way that sex is, right? And then it's not this clear-cut idea that gender maps perfectly onto sex, because the performative aspect of gender means that people's assumptions about you and your existence are completely incongruent to sex as it is already. It doesn't make it the same as being a different sex, but as far as other people are concerned, it doesn't make any difference. People aren't seeing your genitalia. People aren't they aren't looking at your chromosomes. They aren't genotyping you on the spot, right? They're making an assumption through a bunch of social prescriptions and then assigning you a gender based on that, which is different from a sex assignation where they do understand these, when there is this kind of biological concept. And that's where the ideas of sex and gender, they differ down these two different lines. And then of course then you also get these ideas where dysphoria comes from, and different types of dysphoria as well, etc., etc. Now there are some trans people who do not have dysphoria. They don't have this they do not have a sense of discomfort with a certain sex or gender prescription that's been assigned to them. They get a thing called gender euphoria, when they will maybe go along with a different set of gendered prescriptions, or maybe even a set of prescriptions, maybe something that isn't even prescription, doesn't have a gender prescription associated with it at all, and is outside of the colloquial understanding of the way in people present their genders. Now, some of these people would be non-binary, some of these people would be transgender, some of these people might even be cisgender. Like, they just enjoy being outside of this particular level of presentation. Now, gender presentation in this way is separate to gender identity, which again is separate to the way that people perceive you as well. So what gender is, it's kind of like a mishmash of all of these different concepts together in a way that we look at gender as a concept. Okay, so let's bring this all together. So sex is complicated, and in the vast majority of circumstances holds very little social utility, because a lot of these biological things that we would ascribe to sex aren't actually part of the way in which we interact in our daily lives. So the next step from there, once we've assumed that sex isn't particularly relevant with regards to social interaction or social ascriptions and social prescriptions, then we move along towards gender and gender as a concept. Now, I'm not saying there aren't sex-based things that are important. Reproductive rights, for example, is very important, but it's a separate issue from a gendered issue, right? So then we have a look at this concept of gender and the way in which people fit into society in this particular way can lead to a level of animosity between groups of people. And I mentioned TERFs already in this particular conversation, in that TERFs believe that biological sex is an immutable concept, and its distinction from gender should mean that we do not acknowledge gender as being the important concept out of the two of these, right? That because sex is immutable and it is more all-encompassing of a person's experience in the world than how they present or how they experience their gender, we should just write off gender entirely, and we should only look at people through what people's sexual descriptions, right? So, how is this going to be? That's not really a part of. That doesn't really have many explanations that you can think of. So, for example, if you see someone and then you perceive them to be a woman, that is going to be what leads you to acting in ways that are affected by that assumption. So what I'm trying to get at is the idea that people who are maybe misogynistic or may treat women a certain way are not going to do that based upon your biological makeup, your chromosomes, because they don't know. They don't know what that is. They're not genotyping you on the fly. They are using your gender representation, and then the way that fits in to an existing gender paradigm to be able to then make those assumptions that leads them to have these kind of thoughts, right? So this is where I think, in my personal experience, this idea of sex being this immutable concept that overarches ideas of the way in which we should advocate for civil rights, that's why I think it breaks down. And I think we should clearly have a more nuanced understanding in which we talk about gender and we talk about sex and the ways in which the social utility of each of these concepts shapes the material interests of different groups. This should be the way in which that we look at legislation, the way we have a look at the way in which we delineate people within society, because one of these is a lot more easy to ascribe than the other, especially at a glance rather than outside of the doctor's office, where I've already said is where biological sex is a more important concept. So how does this affect trans people? Now, one of the things that has been talked about a lot with regards to issues of gender is single-sex spaces. Now, this is a very thorny issue because you have two sets of groups who have completely differing points of view on this issue. So TERFs and gender-critical people would say that, well, if we have what we perceive to be men because we're assigned male at birth and we're making these ascriptions to them, if we give them access to single-sex spaces, then they would use that as an opportunity to be able to commit heinous acts. Now, first of all, this doesn't make any sense. For one reason is that there's no magical chromosome force field in changing rooms that could stop a man from just illegally doing that if he wanted to. Like, if he was going to go into a woman's change room, he'd just go in. He doesn't need an excuse of pretending to be a trans woman at this time. But then again, as they've understood that concept, they then change it to go, well, no, actually, trans women are just naturally more likely to be able to do them and gives them opportunities. But then that's not borne out in the data either. That the fact these people have conflicting interests has led to a lot of tension. Now, from what I've seen from all of the studies involved in this, trans women are no more of a danger to cis women than other cis women are, and aren't a danger in the way that cis men have been over time, stereotypically. So I think this argument breaks down quite a lot. But you can see how the way in which people talk about sex and the way people talk about gender has shaped issues such as these to be very polarizing. And you can see with regards to legislation that's been passed, say for example in the UK, for example, they had wasn't passed in the end, was through the Gender Recognition Act was going to be theoretically reformed, but there was a public policy survey that was done, where a bunch of TERFs answered the survey, but a bunch of trans people did too, and it came that most people were kind of okay with making it easier to change their gender marker on their official documentation. But you could see where the amount of division was coming on these issues. Because when you have one particular world paradigm, which is very kind of based around a murky idea of sex rather than a very difficult idea of gender, these people came to a head at this point. Now, another issue is healthcare. So trans people require hormones to move across from one set of, secondary sex characteristics to another, and surgeries to be able to do that too, which again makes them part of this kind of abstract group where some of the sex characteristics that you would expect them to be on one sex are there and some of them aren't. So for example, someone who's been on HRT and had surgery has different secondary sex characteristics to the chromosomal makeup that you would expect for having them, right? So they become another they're another kind of person who makes the kind of concept of sex incongruent, which means that it makes it difficult to legislate again with regards to sex as a concept. You have to again look at the way in which we ascribe gender to be the way in which we would legislate on these issues. And healthcare for trans people has become another thorny issue, because one of the things, I know in my case was very true, dysphoria is caused by an incongruence. And these incongruences are very maximized during puberty. For example, if you go through, I'm just going to go through a trans feminine lens because this is what I have the experience with, in that if you are assigned male at birth and you have testosterone in your system, as you go through puberty, that would give you, more hair, it would give you more body hair, it would make you with larger shoulders, gives you an Adam's apple, gives you a higher hairline that I definitely don't have. And these things are where you see the large disparity in the way people would socially view the prevailing gender paradigm, right? They would see that woman is person who has slim shoulders, who has low hairline and not very much body hair, and they would have the prescription of a man being the opposite of that. So by going through puberty, you then move away from the social prescriptions that are assigned to the social role that you feel in your own internal sense of gender does not represent you. So that leads to a lot of dysphoria. How do we alleviate this? Well, there are things called hormone blockers, which will, as a child, lead you to not develop puberty until you are off those blockers, right? They're a reversible procedure that you use to delay the onset of puberty. So that if you, as we've already discussed, when you have an internal sense of your own gender very, very young, and if you feel this incongruence, this is going to start happening around about puberty. So if you, after going through plenty of evaluations by psychologists and people specializing in doctors specializing in gender dysphoria, you go through all of these jump through all these different hoops. They can put you on these blockers, say, okay, we do not know if you are transgender right now, when you don't know either because your brain's not fully developed. How about we put you on these blockers, and then if it turns out that you're not transgender, you can just go off them and start puberty again. But if you feel like you will continuing to show signs of gender dysphoria, then we can continue along that path until you become 16, and then we can put you on cross-sex hormones and move you towards the being in part of having the physical characteristics that you would associate with your internal sense of gender, right? So this does two things. First of all, it assumes that we have a medical system that knows what's best for children, or at least has their best interests at heart. Now, I firmly believe that they do, and a lot of the research would show that people who have supportive families and who have existence with people who reify their trans existence lead happier lives, and their level of suicide rate is decreased dramatically. What happens if a doctor is wrong, though? What happens if a doctor maybe isn't careful with something like this and puts someone on hormones too early, or puts them on blockers when they shouldn't have been, and this person then ends up they're not being trans? This happened in the UK with someone called Kira Bell. She was originally diagnosed with gender dysphoria by a doctor and was put on hormones too quickly, and then ended up, when regretting her transition and detransitioning, which we stand detransitioners in this house. You're a detransitioner. We do not hold any ill will towards any detransitioners, because that's part of the gendered experience, is exploring how that works. And I think the doctors didn't show a good level of care in her case. But this is being used as a stick to be the general idea of trans healthcare for children, so much so that there was a ruling by the courts that restricted trans healthcare because of this specific case of a single doctor's level of somewhat negligence, right? But as I said before, puberty blockers are actually reversible. So there's not a massive risk going on here. The only issue is if people go on them too quickly. And so all it needs, it's not a case of we just ban everything right now. You don't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. You actually have to go back and then refine these issues. But then, because this has been such a high profile case, it's been the easiest stick that gender critical people have been able to use to beat the trans movement with, which is very frustrating from our end, because once you go through puberty, it's very difficult to reverse. I'm stuck here with these massive fucking shoulders for life now. If I'd have gone on puberty blockers, they wouldn't be there. And the continual dysphoria that I feel from having a body that is incongruent with my maternal sense of gender, that's never going to go away. And if I'd have had that issue, and if I had access to a blocker for what puberty would have done to my body, I'd be a lot happier now than I was previously. A lot happier. But I've never been able to get that opportunity, and a lot of other kids won't be able to. And also, the other thing that puberty blockers do, by being able to transition people earlier without going through the wrong side of puberty, it ameliorates another issue that we have, which is trans women in sports, for example, which is what Caitlyn fucking Jenner has been waxing lyrical about on the news, about how she thinks the trans women shouldn't compete in women's sports, right? These differences between people assigned male at birth and people assigned female at birth, that make some AIMA people a little bit more likely to win at certain kinds of sports in certain situations. These differences go away, or that at least they become more ameliorated the earlier someone transitions, or the less that they've gone through the wrong set of puberty, right? Because at the end of the day, the bodies of young children are very, very similar in terms of their biological makeup and the way in which, their muscle strength and their bone density, all that kind of stuff, is very, very similar until you go through the puberty process. So if you can then block that so that they never go through the original wrong puberty as far as they're concerned with regards to their own internal sense of their own gender, you then make it so there is not this perceived gap between the way in which trans people and cis people might engage in sports in a different way. But can't be having that, because the whole trans sports issue is the way in which gender critical people are using to attack trans women. Because if you watch Transphobia: A Short History by Mia Mulder, she points out through all of the kind of chop logic and poorly cited studies and unsubstantiated claims and data, that most of these issues people have with trans people just, at the end of the day, boil down to the fact that people just think that we're kind of gross and they don't want to be around us. They don't want us to exist in society because they feel like an innate resentment towards our existence, whether it be because of some kind of religious notion about the idea of what men and women should be, or this connection to the idea of what biological sex is, all that kind of stuff. These lead to a level of disgust that people have with the trans existence in general. So they then post hoc justify it. And if people are more likely to pass, which is the idea of people not understanding that you're trans because they assume that you're cis when they see you, rather than assuming they're a trans woman. For example, when people look at me, they look at me and go, that's a trans woman. They don't say that's a cis woman or a cis man. No, that's a trans woman. They understand that my gender presentation is a woman. I mean, I've got fucking tits now, right? They understand that, but I still have enough masculine features from the male puberty that I've gone through to be able to clock me as being someone who wasn't assigned female at birth, right? So that's a thing that happens. Whereas if you transition people earlier and they go on these puberty blockers and they don't go through a lot of these irreversible things that puberty does to your body, they're going to pass more often. They're not going to have these differences that they would have from the other birth assignations. So these differences are going to dissipate. So that's why I think deep down people have these issues with puberty blockers, because it wouldn't give them the excuses that they have to be able to discriminate against trans people. It's true. Genital checking things, stuff that's super gross. One thing that is gross, in Florida, I think it was, there was a bill that was saying that they would have to ban trans women from, being treated like in schools, rather, trans girls from being a part of the girls' communities in school, whether it be sports or changing rooms or toilets, etc., etc. And so, well, how are you going to police this, especially at that age, where, especially if they've not gone through a lot of puberty, then there's not that much difference between the way in which they present themselves. So that could only theoretically be done by checking people's genitals. I'm just like, okay, this is the feminist world you want to live in. Like Posey Parker, noted transphobe, said that to defend women against trans women in bathrooms, you'd have armed male guards in bathrooms. I'm like, so you're putting actual cis men in the women's bathroom? Like, that's what you're saying that you don't want. Like, it's such a ridiculous position that these people have, that they will jump through any amount of hoops to be able to legislate against trans people, regardless of how nonsensical it is. It's very, very frustrating. So yeah, things are pretty murky for trans people, especially in the UK right now, where not only is legislation going against us, and court cases going against us, also public opinion is turning against us as well. There are very, very high profile activists who don't know anything about gender, but they reckon they know something about gender. Like, they reckon they can wax lyrical about some transgender issues. People like J.K. Rowling, people like Robert Webb, people like Jacqueline Wilson. Are these people almost like people, these Times columnists, these mostly middle class cis white women who don't have anything actually going on wrong in their lives at all, trying to develop some manufactured persecution complex to be able to essentially just try and justify the fact that they just don't really like trans people very much. That's what it stems from. And as I have discussed, through the way in which social roles determine the way in which we look at gender, and the way in which sex is a murky concept, and all these kind of things, it's just untenable when you think about it from a logical perspective. So there you go. And then moving forward, we have to look about like how non-binary people fit into these kind of things, and if we kind of think that if gender as a social construct and as a social prescription is very, very regimented in the way we look at it, if people are outside of that and they have genders that do not correlate with the kind of the Abrahamic or religious view of what constitutes the gender binary, then that leaves people freer to be able to be less bound by those social prescriptions moving forward, which I think is a good thing too. And that's the worst part, is that they feel like that they've gone through a GCSE in biology and they think they know more than a bunch of people who actually do know what they're talking about, because trans people have to do this. We have to, like, we can't just be laymen anymore. We have to be experts on biology and sociology and psychology and gender studies and gendered science, and we have to be endocrinologists. We have to be all of these different special things just to justify our own existence. Whereas any fucking Tom, Dick, or Harry can come off the street and say, "Nah, but boy equals PP, girl equals Vagoo," and that's the level of discussion that we have to have about these issues. Very, very frustrating. But yeah, I'm kind of worried about what's going to be happening to trans people moving forward, but we shall see. If you look at actual social acceptance of trans people in general, in Europe in general, it has gone up over time. Maybe a dip right now, which, as we've seen with gay rights being coming through in the 80s, there was this big kind of reactionary movement against them, which used many of the same arguments. They're corrupting our children, they're doing this, they're doing that, etc., etc. It's all the same arguments then. It's all the same manufactured, nonsensical bullshit that has no basis in science or no basis in reality that we've had we've seen that all before in the 80s, we're seeing now with trans people, and it's completely transparent. This is Biology 101, and Physics 101 is electrons are particles that orbit the nucleus, maybe look at things above the surface level. Well, that's what I always say. It's just like my qualification is in physics, and I'm just like, okay, so you think you know science from what you're taught at school, yeah? Yes, I do that. Oh, okay, right. So you'll know that light is a wave then, and they go, yeah, of course light's a wave. Yeah, light refracts through things, and you look at the Michelson-Morley experiment, you look at all these kind of things, the Tussle experiment. Clearly, it's a wave. It behaves like a wave, and I'm like, okay, brilliant. Actually, it's a particle, because if you actually learn about it, that light's a particle called photons, because we can actually see through light far away. It has a discrete element to it, and they go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I guess it's just a particle then. You're wrong again. It's actually both. And then suddenly, when you actually look into things from a proper perspective that is, properly educated on these issues, you learn that the simplistic models that we have for our existing paradigms are just that. They're simplistic models so that people who are experts can explain these issues they can explain these issues to laymen in ways that make sense to them. Because if you went into the actual truth of things, it'd be very, very difficult. Like, for example, how many people who espouse the idea of, oh, it's just biology that trans people are wrong? How many people know the difference between karyotype and phenotype? I bet you 100% of them don't know the difference between karyotype and phenotype. Which, to be fair, to explain, karyotype is about the chromosomal makeup of the person, and the phenotype is about the physical things that they express, which is why intersex people are different, because those karyotypes and phenotypes are very, very different to what we'd expect from a regular male or female person with the sex descriptions that we have currently. Now, it's funny how the people saying that. It's funny how people saying that girls and women's sports, this is the first time any conservative has ever cared about women's sports. It's been a long-running joke that people don't give a shit about women's sports for such a long time, and now suddenly trans people want to get involved. Oh no, what's going to happen to the women's sports? Fuck off! You never fucking cared. Bullshit. So, for example, when you look at someone who's been on hormone therapy, like, for example, I have a male karyotype but a female phenotype, or at least from an outward perspective, because you can't see my genitalia, but I have tits now, which is part of the female phenotype, at least as far as the social utility as people are concerned, right? Because at the end of the day, what is actually scientifically the actual cases and the actual case in a lot of these issues, a lot of the time, these don't serve any social utility as far as people are concerned, right? They'll have a look at the fact they've got tits and say, "Wow, that's a woman." That's all their brain goes through. And as far as their idea of biological sex, it is just those secondary sex characteristics, because they haven't genotyped me. They don't know what gametes I produce, because they don't know any of this stuff. They just make a prescription on the physical features that they can see right then. And that's the social utility that sex has with regards to culture, and then that maps on certainly to amount of gender descriptions as well. And then it just makes it a little bit more complicated when we have a look at an internal sense of gender too. Yes and no about trans women and the advantages in cis women's sports. There are some advantages and some disadvantages, right? But the idea that trans women are naturally predisposed to be better at better at all sports by default, rather. Sorry, that's been proven to be incorrect. But there are because muscle density goes up, but over a certain amount of time, your ability to rebuild muscle goes down, because a lot of trans women have lower testosterone levels than cis women do, which is interesting. So yeah, it's a murky kind of concept. But again, this would all be ameliorated if we just let people transition earlier and get on hormone blockers earlier, so they didn't have to go through the male puberty, so they didn't develop all of these things that theoretically could make them more predisposed to be better at sports, right? But of course, that's not good enough either. So, just have to jump through millions of hoops, because they put these manufactured hoops up in front of trans people deliberately so they can legislate against us. That's just what they do. It's just what they do. But I do think that we should just kind of not make people transition, but give people the ability to be able to transition at a young age. I mean, socially transition at the very least, or at least be able to, if they go on, if they exhibit signs of gender dysphoria, such that you can have a unequivocal definition once they've gone through enough psychological screening and they've gone through enough. If you've gone through enough of the psychological evaluation procedures, that gets you to the point in which you can be sure of these people's gender, these people's gender dysphoria, and actually diagnose them, be able to put them on puberty blockers at a point at which they wouldn't go through they wouldn't necessarily go through the kind of puberty that would make them predisposed to be better at sports in these cases. Because I said, the vast majority of the time, when vast majority of the time, people who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria at a young age then go on to transition later on anyway. But people who show a level of gender people who show what's the word I'm looking for? Because there's a difference between actual gender dysphoria and just gender non-conformity, right? That's the word I'm looking for. People just assume that what's happening is some little boys and some boys ends up playing with dolls, and then the mother takes them to a doctor, and doctor goes, right, estrogen, cut their dick off. That's not what happens, right? People think that's what happens, but that's not what's happening. They go through these intensive psychological screening procedures, and they go through loads of different analyses from different doctors, and they put them on hormone blockers at some point, like 11, 12, I think it is, and then they continue having these screening things and saying, you sure how you're feeling, etc., etc. And then once they've gone past the age of 16, then they can go on hormone, like actually go on cross-sex hormone. So people aren't being transitioned, at least not medically, until they're at least 16, right? And there's so many misconceptions. Like, people say, well, I disagree with the idea of children having gender reassignment surgery. That literally no children are having gender reassignment surgery, especially not in the UK. You have to be 18. As far as I know, the person I actually know in the world who's had sexual reassignment surgery before the age of 18 is pop star Kim Petras, who had it at 16 in Germany. That's it. That's the only person I can think of, right? Especially in the UK specifically, you have to be 18. So no, this isn't happening. This idea that people have in their minds, that this idea that doctors are just coming on hacking bits off children willy-nilly, it's fucking bullshit. It's nonsense. It's been perpetuated by people who have a bone to pick with trans people, and who haven't looked at the issues, haven't looked at the data, and don't know what the fuck's going on. Like, these people just have these wild ideas about what the trans existence is and what trans healthcare looks like, and none of it's based in reality, because they've been fed a bunch of misinformation by people who have an agenda, rather than people who actually care about the existence of trans people. It's infuriating. It's completely infuriating that people won't have this kind of evidence-based approach to it, because people who exhibit gender non-conformity most of the time end up getting people that exhibit just regular signs of gender conformity end up growing out of it. And that's why has to be this psychological delineation between what's just some amounts of gender nonconformity and genuine gender dysphoria, right? These are two very, very separate and different things that happen to people. So you have to understand where these differences come in, and why when when children are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, that's when the rate of transition is very, very high. But when it's just gender non-conformity, the level of transition is very, very low. That's why these psychological evaluations are so important, right? And the outcomes of which is that people who do exhibit signs of gender dysphoria and do end up transitioning, all of the data shows these people are happier, they live better lives, they less prone to suicide, all these kind of things. The suicide rate drops absolutely dramatically. 15/16 is the amount of which the suicide rate drops for people who have gender dysphoria who then go through a level of transition, right? So these healthcare things are very, very important. So people putting obstacles in front of them based off huge amounts of misinformation is incredibly damaging to the trans existence and the trans movement, and to people and people's lives as well. Like, there definitely should be some level of care that we have, so that things like happened to Kira Bell do not happen in future, right? People aren't put on cross-sex hormones when they don't go through the proper evaluations, right? Well, that's just a teething issue. That's just like saying, oh, well, we had this one issue with video-assisted referee where someone was declared as offside when they weren't. But that's not a reason to just get rid of fucking VAR altogether. You just have to make it better. You have to change things so that we get the actual outcomes that we want. And if people can have the issues that going through puberty has ameliorated, not only does it make it better for them, it makes it better for society as well, on multiple different ways, because people getting socialized as their actual gender earlier means you don't get these issues about people going through a certain amount of socializations that lead them down certain thinking patterns in the way that people grow up, because people's environments do shape the way in which they exist, right? I definitely, as someone who transitioned at 25, I guess going to have 25, 26, 26, is going to have a much different experience of my transness than someone who transitioned at 15, right? So, yeah, it's a rough subject, but hopefully I've managed to at least get people at least somewhat engaged with the idea of what trans existence looks like, why trans people are the way that they are, the common arguments against trans people, and the data that surrounds how trans healthcare goes through society, and what social affirmation does for trans people, right? I think I've done a reasonable job. I kind of minced my words a lot and tripped over words a couple of bits there, but I think I did a reasonable job. So I should be able to have this video up on my YouTube channel. So if people want to go to someone in their family or someone of their friends and say, "Here's someone explaining how trans existence works," they might have something that would make it easy for them to understand that.